We are live. Good morning, everybody. Joining us here on Ask the Agronomist, live from Virginia, Illinois, Sunrise FS. Brett Isley, thank you for hosting us here in your beautiful new conference room facility here in lovely downtown. Well, not quite downtown Virginia, but Virginia, Illinois. So we're on the road this morning. I had to get up early, and my friend and colleague Chris Kallal is here with us today. I know people have been very excited about having Chris on the show. We get lots of complaints typically that we need better agronomy people on the program. So we got one here today with Chris, and he's here today to tell us about the research he's done over the last 3 years on crown rot. And crown rot's a topic that we've talked about a lot of times on previous episodes, and kind of got the expert here with us today to dig a little deeper into that topic. And we're also very excited. This is our last episode for the 2021 season. We will start up fresh in 2022. We probably should have talked about that. What's the first Thursday of the first week in January, Jennifer? The 6th. So let's say January 6th will be our next episode. So we're going to take the rest of this year off. So this is our last program for the year. It's been a great year here on Ask the Agronomist. I've loved doing this. We want to continue this. We get good feedback on it, and kind of to celebrate, appreciate, and thank our people that have helped us make this successful, which would be those of you who join and ask questions live and such. We are going to do a giveaway at the end for 6 bags of DKC 6595, which is getting difficult to get. So we got some good stuff for you here on Ask the Agronomist. And to qualify for that, what you need to do is you need to be logged into our live chat. You don't actually have to ask a question, just say hi to Jennifer or whatever, but chat something into the chat, and that will get you qualified for the giveaway that Jennifer is going to do at the end of the program here. So without further ado, I got Chris sitting here being quiet and sitting still, which is very difficult for him. So we'll get right into it. So Chris,
let's go back. What episode is this?
I can't even remember.
21.
Okay, 21st episode. Okay. So that's
cool. So before we get started, I guess hats off to Lance for doing this. This is one of the things he's great at. One of the many is taking questions. I joke that he's got the ability to basically talk to anybody about anything at the drop of a hat, and at length. And so this is something that wasn't an insult, Lance. But he's got the ability to do that, and he absolutely loves this. I mean, this is one of the things he's passionate about. If you know Lance, you can see him rolling up his sleeves. He's ready to get down to business. This is one of the things he's extremely passionate about doing, whether it was at field days or whatever. He loves to answer questions from customers. And so that's hats off to him for his time and effort for doing this. And then Jennifer and Adam that have been, so Jennifer's with us today here, Adam's not, but to Jennifer and Adam for the crew of helping do this every 2 weeks, because it is a pretty serious time commitment. Yep. But
more than I realized when we started it. Frankly, I didn't plan on imposing on my teammates as much as I have. But I
wanted to take the opportunity to at least congratulate them and commend them for their efforts before we get going.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So I'll let Chris kind of explain what he's done and why he started looking at it, and we'll dig deeper into crown rot as we go here. But why don't you just tell everybody what you've been working on?
Yeah. So a little bit of the history on this is it goes back to the fall of 2018. And so in fall of 2018, Lance and I both got several phone calls where we got customers that were curious about, what was going on in their cornfields. And we were seeing down corn, we were seeing, some poor yields in areas, and it was spotty in fields. And there was a lot of things that we were scratching our head. And so, got to digging into it, and it was crown rot. So it's kind of what we had decided. The main issue was crown rot. And so at that time, we started kind of scratching around, trying to think, as growers are looking at us saying, like they typically do, what can I do to try to help eliminate or alleviate this in the future? And unfortunately, at that time, we really didn't have, at least I didn't feel like we really had a great story or answers that we could give the guys or give our customers, which was frustrating for me, and I know it was for you as well, to be able to not have really much of an answer. And I think the answers we gave were predominantly based on speculation and not necessarily, information that we had actually gleaned from looking at stuff. And so as that fall kind of unfolded, one of the things that we learned that fall, thanks to one of our peers at the time, had found some documentation out there that suggested that there was a coincidence between high P levels and a high incidence of Fusarium crown rot. And that made a lot of sense to us in that fall of 2018, because a lot of the fields we were seeing issues with were fields that had been heavily manured, and some fields, some of the cases I got involved with over towards the Decatur area in regards to city sludge coming out of the city of Decatur. And I'd also spoken with some other customers that could almost lay a yield map over top of their soil maps, and would suggest that some of the places where they had high P levels in the field is where they saw higher issues. And so that data is out there, and it does seem to kind of, I wouldn't say it's always the case, but it does seem to kind of correlate with what we see,
Right.
Especially the manure field. Right?
And I would say, in addition to high fertility environments, the better your soils are, the higher organic matter soils, the darker soils, the more productive soils. I mean, one of the things that I think is kind of makes crown rot very frustrating. It's almost the better your environment, the higher your yield potential, the better job you're doing managing your crop. You're inadvertently creating a better environment for crown rot.
Correct.
As well.
Yep. So what I set out to do after that fall was basically to try to look at differences in seed treatments, look at some different in-furrow products, look at some V5 applications and what impact they may have, look at VT applications. So I just wrapped up, and I've probably still got some data analysis I'll do. I was just actually monkeying with even some more things this morning, doing some different data cuts before we got here. But I've got 3 years worth of data where I've done basically the exact same trial setup, and it's expanded and shrunk over time. But I've done basically the exact same trial setup for the last 3 years now. And each year, in 19, 20, and 21, I planted 4 locations each year of this. And in 2 of the years, I lost one of the locations. So, one of the things that I did, and some of the locations that I've had, is going back to that year of 18, I put some of the trials back in some of those exact same fields where customers were frustrated and having issues in 18. And so that's kind of been the fun part about this, is I've tried to go into what we would conceive or think of as kind of high pressure environments to truly test the system. So that's a little bit of background, just to kind of help understand what we've done for the last couple of years. And as I said, I've looked at about 3 different seed treatments from us. I got an experimental one this past year that I got to look at. I've probably looked at 4 or 5 different products in furrow so Bayer products in regards to like Proline and Luna Privilege. I've looked at a product called Serenade or Minuet. It's gone by a couple different names over time. I've looked at some competitive stuff. So I did have a question text to me last night. I was asking about Xyway. Okay. And I know you did look at that this year. So we don't advertise our own products or bash others on Ask the Agronomist, but I did want Chris to share his observations, because I know there's a lot of interest in that product. Absolutely. And so in year 1, I looked at Xanthian, which is a BSF product. And then this past year I incorporated Xyway. So I've looked at several different products in furrow as well. And I think the one that what obviously drives a lot of people's attention and excitement around Xyway in particular is that it's got the ability to be mixed with starter fertilizer. Because if you look at a Proline or a Luna Privilege product of ours, our own products, we don't want those mixed with starter fertilizer. We want those with straight water. And in most cases, a guy's not going to have, if a guy's got a liquid system on the planter, it's to run some sort of a pop-up or a startup type fertilizer system. It's not to run straight water and a fungicide. So I think that's where Xyway caught a lot of attention, was that it's got that ability to go with the starter fertilizer. I think the way it's getting promoted most often, though, is through that foam system that I don't know exactly how that works, but there's some sort of special system I think was developed for that product. And so I think a lot of guys have, I'm not sure if it's going on through fertilizer a lot or not, because whatever that partial air delivery system that kind of creates a foam, and it's a very low volume application.
I haven't worked with that system personally, so I don't know a lot about it, but
Yeah, I can't speak to it whatsoever at all.
Okay.
So I don't know anything about it. I mean, most of the guys I
it's
know,
got a fancy name that's escaping me right at the moment. But
most of the guys I know that have been using it, we're running it in furrow. And honestly, I guess my encouragement would be, and I think this is the same that they would state is, if you can get it out of the furrow,
Right,
you're
right.
probably better off because in some cases did see a delay in emergence. So that is one of the potential risk of that product. But to get kind of down to to share, I know I see we got several questions kind of piping in, and I'm guessing Jennifer's going to help us with some of those here quickly. But I guess as I think about it from a grower perspective, really at the end of the day, what I found to be the most beneficial and probably the best levers you can pull to be able to try to minimize the infection is that the biggest one is the VT fungicide, VTR1 fungicide. That's absolutely the what I've discovered in 3 years of doing this has the single biggest impact on minimizing it.
Right. And to explain the way we've measured how we minimize it is at harvest time, you've got those plants that are dying prematurely. We call those ghosted plants.
Yep.
You can walk into these trials and you can count and calculate what's the percentage of ghosted plants. And so the way Chris has been evaluating these different treatments is he reducing the number of plants that are dying prematurely?
Right.
So if in a particular plot, 50% of the plants die prematurely, and in this treatment, 40% of the plants die prematurely, he's getting a reduction in the amount of premature death. And if you keep the plants alive, there should be a yield increase with that, because that's where we're losing yield potential with crown rot is the premature death of the plant. Right. So back up and explain how a fungicide that's being applied at tassel time is helping with a disease that's been in the roots for weeks before that time.
Yep. Yeah. So this is that's a great point and kind of fun to I guess shine a little bit more light on that this year. So if you think about it, what kind of happens is that infection happens early on in the spring, right? So it's kind of, I always tell people it's kind of like SDS in soybeans. So the infection happens when the corn plant is small, predominantly due to a saturated soil at the time. The majority of the time we talk about it being a Fusarium species that causes it, but it can be other species, but the Fusarium would be the predominant one that gets thrown around and utilized when we talk about this. And then over the course of the growing season, as other stresses kind of come into play, that infection manifests itself. And essentially what ends up happening, right, is that it kills the crown. So the below ground portion of the plant where all your roots come out of, right, that's where all your roots come out of, is that begins to die and deteriorate. And as it dies and deteriorates, right, you shut off basically all translocation of water and nutrients from below ground up into the plant. And so you end up with this kind of premature death that Lance was talking about. You end up with kind of this ghosting or this silver kind of look to plants. Ultimately, it ends up, impacting yield. It a lot of times ends up impacting test weight of the grain, and ultimately can also impact late season standability as well, because once you've shut that crown off and that movement from below ground to above ground, you end up consuming, the plant ends up consuming itself or cannibalizing itself.
Long before you could even see it was going to die early, it was cannibalizing itself, trying to survive and trying to make the best of a bad situation, and had unhealthy roots and was under stress. And that's where Chris is headed with this conversation, is that stress mitigation piece of that late season fungicide. There's several things that have to happen for crown rot to get bad. You got to have the early infections, you got to have the right environment, and then you need stress during grain fill to really get that infection to blow up in that root system and take those plants out and ghost those plants. So when you've seen those plants go from green to off green to silver to brown in about 4 days, and the ear goes from like this to like that in about 4 days, those are the ghosted plants that we're referring to.
And we hit a lot of that this year. And so I'm glad you reset that, because I forgot where I was supposed to be going with this conversation. I got distracted. So the reason why we say the VT fungicide has the biggest impact is it's not about the fact that fungicide application is controlling Fusarium crown rot. What it's doing is it's minimizing other stresses that come into play later on in the season, and therefore not allowing the crown rot to actually manifest or become as severe. And so ultimately that's what it's about. I mean, I think when we talk about this, it's what you can do outside of those things, is anything you can do to mitigate stress, whether that's helping your drainage, or if that's making sure you've got ample amounts of nitrogen or whatever, right? I mean, so there's other things that come into play that are other than disease that can be that stress, if you will, that are impacting the corn plant. But that's really what the fungicide is doing. It's helping with control disease, and it's helping the plant rest. And I'm losing the one word that I'm trying to think of, but it's by alleviating all those other stresses, it's helping keeping the crown rot at bay.
And as you talk about your other treatments, you have tested some treatments that probably did reduce the crown rot infection earlier in the season, but in spite of that, they haven't had as big an impact as that VT fungicide.
Correct. Exactly. So like I said, I've done the in-furrow fungicides applications. My data would suggest they have had a positive impact on reducing the severity of the infection. The unfortunate thing is, and that comment does vary by product, but at the end of the day, what I have also seen is the yield bump has not been great enough to pay for itself, to pay for that product.
And the reduction in infection has been relatively small as well.
Exactly, and the reduction in infection has been relatively small.
The way I describe it, when I look at Chris's data, I don't see an in-furrow product that he has tested that makes me want to run out and invest in a $5,000 or $10,000 system for my planter. If I've got one, I'm going to use something in-furrow to help suppress crown rot. But we haven't really, I would say, and you correct me if I'm wrong, we haven't found in all the products that he's looked at in furrow, we haven't found anything in furrow that has been a huge, mover in suppressing crown rot.
To his point, I should have said this earlier. So I've basically got two data points that I'm taking on all these trials. So the percent infection and then yield. So of the 5 in-furrow products I've tested, I think the biggest yield gain I've had has been 2 bushel. And 2 bushel, even at today's commodity prices, is not a positive return on investment for any one of those products. And so that's why again, I mean, for a guy that's got the system already in place, and if they want to play with it, yeah, I think it makes sense, and it's a tool in the toolbox. But it's not, again, to your point, I mean, it's not anything that I would encourage somebody to go out and make a huge investment and hang all that on the planter. Because it's been earth-shattering as far as improvement in both yield and reduction of the crown rot.
And I think too, there are a lot of things with a lot of different systems. It's not one thing; it's a systems approach to it. So the work that Dr. Belo has done at U of I would certainly indicate this. If you pull one component out of a system, that has a different impact than adding one component to a system in some cases. And, Chris has looked at a lot of the, individual things that you could do. In the real world, what a lot of people do is they're doing 5 or 6 things all together to try to address an issue. And when you look at each component individually, you might get a slightly different outcome than when you look at the impact of doing everything you can do to control it. And I think that's something that Chris will talk about here is, if you want to do everything you can do to suppress crown rot, if you've been fighting it bad, there's a whole series of things you can do. Each one of them has maybe a different individual value. But if it's something that's really been frustrating you and you're like, well, what can I do? I want to do everything I can do. It's not just VT fungicide. It's not just in furrow. He hasn't talked about V5 yet, but he will. There are seed treatments that he's tested, and so lots of pieces kind of come together to kind of address the issue.
Right, and I'll hit on the seed treatment piece real quick. So 3 years ago, when I started this, it was important at that time because at the time, from a DEKALB perspective, we were selling both what we considered a basic seed treatment and an elite seed treatment package. And at the time, that was a grower choice. There were certain hybrids, aka a 6434, for example, that was a disease shield hybrid that came automatic with the elite seed treatment package on it. And elite seed treatment, what that is essentially there's three seed treatments on all of our corn that we sell today. And so metalaxyl, which is predominantly on there for Pythium and early season dampening off, and then there's astrobium and trizol. And really those are the two that are impactful from a crown rot perspective or fusarium perspective. And what we did with that elite seed treatment package is we 4x that use rate of those two products. And I remember I'll call out to Rachel Willis, one of our other peers. She helped me in test design and walking some of these trials in year one. You know, when you walk these trials and take these ratings, I remember in year one, the two things that just stood out in every single trial we walked was when you went to the elite seed treatment, you cut the number of infested plants by almost half. And when you went to a VT fungicide treatment, you cut the number of ghosted plants by almost half. And it was as visual as black and white. It was the most visual that I can remember of almost any of the work that I've done and any of the ratings that I've done across these. You know, I've got data off of 10 locations for the past 3 years. And so that one's always been easy. Well, today, from a DEKALB perspective, all of our seed comes treated with elite seed treatment. So, you know, from the get-go, that was always something that I encourage people to do, right. But now it's an automatic, and it's not really a grower choice. There are some other, just to share, I mean, there are some other brands that we do own, that are in our company that it is still grower choice. And I've encouraged those folks and shared my data with them to try to help leverage that as well. When
those products were your choice to add it was usually about a $12 or $13 upcharge to a bag of corn. Very positive ROI on that investment, but it was hard to get people to make that investment. You know, we wanted our seed to have its best chance of showing its full genetic potential. And so we decided to invest up front and just include that better seed treatment on all DEKALB seed. And so, you know, some of you are probably thinking, well, okay, I'm using your elite seed treatment on all my DEKALB seed. I had a shitload of crown rot last year.
Right.
What up with that?
Yep.
So one thing Chris said was, you know, seed treatment reduced it. VT reduced it. You can throw the kitchen sink at crown rot and not eliminate it.
Yep,
so all these things we're doing are making it better, not making it go away.
Right. So. That's a great point, and that's one of the things that has been.
That's what we like to try to do here on Agronomist, Chris, is make great points.
But you know, one of the things I've found is doing this. You're absolutely correct. I mean, so I've you know, as I've designed these trials too, I've used what I refer to as a susceptible hybrid and then a more tolerant hybrid. Okay, so you know, even with the more tolerant hybrid, with the high load seed treatment, with an in-furrow fungicide, with a VT fungicide application, and a V5 and a VT fungicide application. I lost track of what I said there, but you know, throwing everything I could at it, you know, you could still have what a lot of us would still consider a train wreck. And so that was very disappointing, but it's reality, right? And so there's certain things we can do, but to minimize it. But we're not always able to just eliminate it.
Right. The thing that does the best job of eliminating it is a warm, dry spring and a low stress grain fill period.
Right.
So crown rot, you know, rears its ugly head every year somewhere, and it tends to be bad in places that were cold and wet early, with early planting, on good ground with high fertility. And then if that environment happens to be followed up by a stressful grain fill period, which this year the stressful grain fill period was created primarily by foliar diseases more than bad weather. Correct. Bad weather can do it too. Bad weather and foliar diseases make it even worse. And I had some small pockets in my geography that had the full Monty of, you know, the horrible spring conditions, the right environment early, followed by heavy disease pressure late, and some challenging weather environments. And that was where we saw some really, really, really disappointing corn. And something that I, you know, remembered yesterday in talking with Rachel Willis that Chris mentioned earlier. Rachel's on our team. She's actually a pathologist by training. So Chris and I, you know, act like we know something about pathology. Rachel's a pathologist. There's a difference. So, you know, I was thinking about field border syndrome. Mm-hmm. You know, how many years did we talk about that? And
I brought this up yesterday to Jennifer. Okay. If you want to listen to somebody talk about field border syndrome, ask Lance. So, a little irony this morning.
So, unbeknownst to me, back in about 2011, 2012, 2013, when we were getting calls about, hey, why is the outside 8 or 16 rows of my cornfield dying 3 weeks early? And why is it yielding 100 bushel less and a little further into the field? At one time, people thought it was heavier rootworm feeding because the roots were always gone on those plants. Some people thought it was drift of Probably the post-corn graminicide that you were using to clean up volunteer corn and soybeans got blamed the most often. Then when we started using really high rates of glyphosate, people thought, well, maybe we're drifting Roundup on that corn too late in the season. Got to be herbicide related. Well, actually, what it is primarily is greater stress that those plants are under. Those plants need more moisture because of the sun and the wind that they're exposed to. Their evapotranspiration rate is a lot higher. They need more moisture. If they can't get it, they're under more stress and they die early. However, looking back, all those plants are infected with crown rot. And it's actually, I think, primarily crown rot that's driving that field border syndrome. The additional stress that those plants are under, and this kind of relates to what Chris was talking about, is why the crown rots, where the whole field's infected with crown rot, but only the plants under the most stress are dying early from that crown rot infection. The plants that are under less stress are able to live with it. It's hurting them, but they're living with it to full maturity. And that's why you're getting better yield, and you're seeing that huge discrepancy in yield. And as I think back to all the conversations we've had over the years about field border syndrome, we were probably underestimating the impact or the crown rot as a variable in that scenario as well.
So we've done a lot of talking.
Yeah.
I know there's been several questions that have come in.
Yeah.
So why don't we hit a question or two, and maybe we've already addressed some of them as we've rambled on here.
We've just grazed one.
Grazed one.
Yeah.
So we got some work to do.
Yeah. You guys had talked about the other effects that we experienced this year that caused crown rot to kind of rear its ugly head. So Merle Bettel is one of our OGs here as far as customers watching asked, with the onslaught of tar spot, his chemist has recommended he does a half rate of fungicide at V5 and then a full rate at VT. What are your thoughts on VT and V5 in general, and then what do rates look like when you want to do fungicide to help combat those issues?
Yeah, so I knew we hadn't talked about V5 yet, and we were going to get there at some point in time. But yeah, so my data would support that a V5, V6 fungicide application does reduce the infestation percentage, and it also does have a positive impact on yield, and a big enough impact on yield based on what I've seen that it delivers a positive return on investment. It's not as big of a benefit from a reduction standpoint as some of the other things, like the VT fungicide application does, but it does have an impact. And so as I've worked with guys, if guys are doing already a VT R1 application, that V5 application is one of the next things we generally kind of recommend that a guy think about doing to try to help reduce it. The trouble, and I think why it's not as impactful is that its window of residual is impacting kind of more early season stress, and the bigger impact is more that grain fill stress, like Lance talked about, that actually helps truly manifest the disease. And so it does help eliminate some disease or some stress on the plant, but it's not eliminating quite as much stress as what that VTR1 application is.
Well, and I personally think that V5 timing, if you're using the right product under the right conditions, probably has the ability to improve the root health of those plants. And so we might actually, with that application, the VT, we're not suppressing crown rot. We are alleviating stress, which helps the plant survive with a root system infected with crown rot. I think with that V5 application, I think we might be actually reducing the amount of crown rot that's in the root system. So the way that helps is a little bit different than the way the VT helps. They both help. What I like to remind guys, there's a lot of talk about V5, a lot of talk about tar spot. One's got nothing to do with the other. So tar spot does make crown rot worse in this way. Tar spot is an additional stress on the plant during grain fill. Anything that stresses the plant during grain fill is going to make crown rot worse. So there was an interaction between if you had crown rot and no tar spot, things wasn't too bad. If you had tar spot and no crown rot, things weren't even that bad. If you had both, sprinkle in a little southern rust, a little anthracnose, things kind of went to hell at that point. So all these stresses, all these diseases, they all interact with each other. And as you put in more of one and less of another, or more of both, or change this or change that, your end result, your outcome changes. So we are very supportive of a V5-ish, and I say V5-ish because depending on how you're managing your herbicide, you know, if you're spraying herbicide at V3, we don't want fungicide at V3. If you want to spray fungicide at V7, that's great. We don't want herbicide at V7. So we talk about V5 because V5 is kind of where the two windows overlap. If you're not spraying herbicide at V5, you know, and you want to do an early vegetative fungicide, you can separate those two into 2 trips, which most people aren't interested in. But if you do want to make 2 trips, you might spray your herbicide at V2, V3, V4, and delay till maybe V6 or V7 with that fungicide pass. If you can get them to overlap at V5, that's the easiest, cheapest way to do it. That's a good place to start. Generally, we're talking about a half rate with that application. We feel there are differences in products in this way. If all you're trying to do is kill a little bit of anthracnose leaf blight, which might be the only foliar disease that's there at that time, and give that plant a little bit of strobe plant health pick-me-up when it's going through early ear size development, about any fungicide will do that. If you're trying to suppress crown rot, that's a different deal. You know, V5 application's been around for a long time. We haven't been talking about V5 suppressing crown rot for a long time. So that's, I think, kind of a new learning that we're seeing, that if you're using the right product at V5 at the right rate, we can probably have some impact on crown rot. If you're using, you know, the cheapest product you can find at V5, that might help with a little bit of strobe plant health benefits. That might help clean up a little bit of anthracnose leaf blight. Probably not going to do much for crown rot. So you might want to, you know, do a little research, and if you are trying to suppress crown rot with your V5, you know, choose a product that has the ability to do that. The recommendation that you were given, you know, start with a V5, go with a VT. That's kind of that's my base recommendation. I think every acre ought to get a V5. I think every acre ought to get VT. Unfortunately, in 21, in some cases with some hybrids, even that 2-pass program wasn't enough to get you full season-long protection. And so when things are really bad, you know, following up with an R3 or an R4, which would be your 3rd pass, that's 3rd pass of fungicide, which would be, you know, crazy. You know, people would have thought that was nuts a year ago to even think about that. But we did see in some situations where if you've got bad crown rot, if you've got bad southern rust, if you've got bad tar spot and southern rust, you know, you're with those 3 diseases, crown rot, tar spot, southern rust, you're covering the entire growing season with those 3 diseases, because the crown rot's starting really early and the southern rust and tar spot are still raging really late. And so you've got to protect that plant throughout the whole season. Right. And so we did have some environments last year where the best fungicide program would have been a 3-pass program. We're not going to make that a standard recommendation, but you know, if we're given the same environment again someday that we fought through in 21, you know, I'm not going to hesitate to recommend 3 applications of fungicide. The first 2 you're already going to have done. So really the only one that's kind of in question would be that 3rd R3, R4 pass.
So to hit on rate real quick on that, that is one thing that
wait real quick.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So this historically, I've been using 4 ounces of Delaro is what I've been using for that V5, V6 application, and that's what I've used the last couple of years. Next year, my thought and my intent is that I do want to play with rate some on that V5, V6 application in these high pressure situations. So I may move on up to an 8-ounce application or maybe even higher. And the other thing that I'm going to bring in is I'm going to probably be leaning on Delaro Complete now instead of Delaro for that application, because in some of my data, the Luna Privilege product, which is the addition to Delaro to make Delaro Complete, that product has shown some nice benefit against reducing the infestation levels. And so since that in-furrow and that V5 application are really kind of more probably about limiting the actual infection and controlling that infection, that's one of the things that I will incorporate more so into next year. So We have another question, Jennifer.
Not necessarily related to crown rot. So if you have any other final comments on crown rot, I'll let you wrap that up, and then we might be able to get into soybeans here shortly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one thing I do want to hit on is, I mean, hybrid does matter, without a doubt, right? So, I mean, a hybrid like a 6434, for example, that is very good from a disease standpoint and its ability to ward off, inherently ward off southern rust or gray leaf spot. Or other diseases, since it has the ability kind of within itself to try to limit those diseases on the plant and how much they impact the plant. A lot of times then generally you have less crown rot with those plants. I obviously saw more differentiation across products this year than I have historically. A lot of my data would suggest that hybrid didn't make a tremendous amount of difference historically. What also is a trend in the data that I saw is that when you have a healthier hybrid like a 6434, the impact of some of the other management tactics you can deploy isn't as impactful. And that's because in the most case, the hybrid is doing the majority of the heavy lifting. And those other products aren't as impactful, where you have a weaker product in regards to its ability for crown rot or in-season diseases. Those other impacts generally can be a little bit greater.
And I think a good case in point of that would be, in our lineup this year, every hybrid that was highly susceptible to southern rust appeared to be highly susceptible to crown rot as well. And some of those products in past years, we thought were fairly tolerant to crown rot. So I think in some cases, it all gets kind of convoluted, and we can't really tell if a hybrid is healthier at the end of the year because it truly had less crown rot infection, or did it just stay healthier for some other reason and was under less stress? And so the crown rot infection that it also had didn't cause as much damage. And that's really hard to separate that out. But I would agree with Chris. We saw a lot more separation in hybrids this year. The two hybrids he picked when he started this work, he picked them specifically because one of them we knew was pretty susceptible, and one of them we thought was fairly tolerant. And he ran all these treatments he's talked about across both of those hybrids, and the difference between the two hybrids in regards to crown rot. Now, there was a big difference in yield between the two hybrids, but basically the percentage of crown rot that they had didn't vary near as much as he and I probably expected it to. But this year, with all the other stresses we had going on, when he looked at 10 or 12 different hybrids,
12 different hybrids.
There was a pretty big degree of separation. Now, we're not necessarily at a point where we feel we can recommend, specific hybrids to, control crown rot, but we do, recognize that there are differences. Some of those differences might be related to how susceptible they are to the infection, but I think looking at the hybrid list, it's kind of, I don't think it's a coincidence that all the hybrids that had less crown rot are all the hybrids that have better foliar plant health. So I think that's probably being driven more by their better late season plant health than it is they got less crown rot infection when they were that tall in the spring.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So one last plug, and then we can probably move on. Is at some point in time, my intention is to put together a video, much like I did a year ago, to summarize my data. We'll actually show the graphs, and we'll talk about some of the graphs and some of the actual raw data. So be looking for that. It may be a Christmas break project for me if I have time to get to it. I've got some other things that I need to do at that time, but at some point in time, I will get that done. We will share it on our social media. We'll have it on the YouTube page, but we'll try to get it out for those of you that are interested. So
excellent.
Alrighty, so like I mentioned, we're going to go ahead and move on into soybeans.
Okay.
So the big question is, as an industry, we've seen a transition into those earlier planted soybeans and earlier season soybeans. So there's a concern that if we see another year of cold, wet, what are your thoughts on early planted beans? And then layering in a question from Dr. Full, would you ever consider, obviously same trait platform, but would you ever consider mixing an offensive and a defensive bean to help combat that?
Good, fun question.
So I'll start on the first part. I guess from my perspective, I'm as much of a fan as about anybody for early maturing beans planted early. I have a lot of people that I work with that have been extremely successful doing it. I contend that part of the reason why those beans are generally really good is we put them on some of our best ground, right? Because most of the time you don't ever put you don't ever plant first on some of your tougher acres. You don't ever harvest first on some of your tougher acres, right? So they're on some of the more well-drained soils, high fertility, high management. And the other thing that I love to joke about it, why generally early beans early are so good, is because we harvest them when they're ready the first time. And a lot of times, probably 13-14% plus type moistures, and so we're not letting those beans dry down. So I kind of poke fun that's part of the sizzle, right, if you will, as to why they're so good and why they're so fun.
Well, and they're also the first beans that get planted,
right,
too. And so back to the planting date effect, that's been the single largest yield determining factor in soybeans that we have looked at. More than variety, more than fungicide at R3, more than insecticide, more than fertility, more than population, more than row spacing, more than anything else we've tested, early planting has been a bigger driver for yield. And so that's why, Jennifer, the trend has been to move that planting date up. Now, we have lived through some painful experiences related to that. We've had beans replanted from freezes and frosts. We've had increased levels of herbicide injury. We've had, fields that, even though they got planted early, did not canopy early because it took them so long. And that's something I like to point out. If you plant a bean April 1st and you plant a bean May 1st and they flower on the same day and canopy on the same day, I don't think there'll be any yield benefit to the April 1st over the May 1st planting. So the trick to benefiting from early planting is the plant actually needs to be ahead in growth and development. And in some cases, it is kind of frustrating because some of the seed treatments we use to suppress SDS and the herbicides that we use to give us good water hemp protection and planting in cold, wet soils. I'm a no-till guy, and I have to concede that I'm not sure if you're no-tilling light timber soil, March 30th planted beans might not be for you. Right. So you can push it too far in some environments.
That's the one. As I've looked at the last 2 years, I'd say a lot of this whole concept started with people that were on freshly tilled ground,
yep,
and
dark
prairie soils, right? I mean, those were the first early adopters of early beans early. And a lot of people have looked at that and said, wow, that looks pretty cool,
right,
pretty successful.
Right.
And they've heard
I'll
some
take that extra yield too.
That's right. I'll take that extra yield as well. And unfortunately, I think what we've learned the last 2 years is when we have cool, wet springs like we've had the last 2 years, the reduced till acres, when you've got cover crop involved, the reduced till acres and the cover crop acres, we unfortunately, we don't get as big of a bang out of it as we do the conventional till acres. So I'm trying to kind of soften the excitement a little bit with my folks that are more in that reduced till situation, just because that's where we've had higher risk, and I don't think we've seen as big of a benefit out of it as we've had. One of the things, when you made that comment a second ago, it reminded me of some data that a good friend of mine at another organization put together years ago. They had interns go out and track the growth stage every day. So they had early planted beans, and they did a planting date study basically on soybeans. And they went out and they looked at the growth stage of those beans every single day during the entire growing season. And what they found basically is that early planted beans spent more time in R2. And my perception is that, again, that's part of the sizzle, if you will, from early planted beans, is they spend more time flowering.
Which is full flower.
Full flower,
those who don't know what R2 is.
Yep.
So that's probably one of the key reproductive stages for the soybean plant. And the longer you're in those reproductive stages versus vegetative stages, we think that's where the extra yield potential is coming from. Plus, they get into those reproductive stages earlier in the season, when you got better sunlight in a normal year,
yep,
and better growing conditions generally.
Yep.
So, and I'll follow up on Dr. Full's follow-up question about the blends. You actually can buy blends in the marketplace, and they are an attempt to do exactly what he's talking about, and that is mix a quote-unquote defensive variety with an offensive variety. The people that are promoting that practice, do have some data to support that there can be benefits to that. And in theory, the way that works is if the defensive variety kind of is dominant in the stressful parts of the field, and the offensive variety is dominant in the high yield parts of the field, can you end up with a better average than using all defensive or all offensive? The challenge in that becomes it's a huge logistical challenge for the seed company, quite frankly, and not that you guys care about our logistical challenges, but if you want to do that yourself on farm, you could get set up to do that. It would be virtually impossible for Asgrow to do that on 20 million units of soybeans that we're trying to get out timely in the spring for all you guys that want to plant March or something or other. So we're not going to go there. That concept is out there from some other companies. They do feel that there's a benefit there. I've seen some data that would maybe support that. It's a little bit hard to. One challenge I think with that is about the time your offensive bean has a poor year and your defensive bean has a great year, then your defense became your offense and your offense became your defense, and things get kind of jacked up a little bit. So I don't know that that's a big enough deal to, we're talking pretty small, minute increases in yield. It's not a 4 or 5 bushel thing. It's a 0 to 1 or 2 bushel thing. So I think for a lot of people, the effort it would take to do the blend and do the mixing and decide, which 2 to put together would probably be more work than other things you could do that might have a bigger impact on your yield.
Next question we had about environment, it would be corn and beans here really in general, but what are your thoughts on insect pressure that you saw in 21, and do you think there's any signals of what's going to be happening in 2022?
Certainly the rootworms, the insect that we talk about the most, and we've got a 2 or 3 year trend we've been on here where rootworm pressure has been increasing. That increase is primarily being felt corn on corn. On our rotated acre and Chris and I's footprint, we are very comfortable with non-rootworm corn without insecticide getting planted on the rotated acre. We have found some hot spots corn on corn. I do think that we need to remain vigilant against rootworm, and Chris and I both really appreciate those that are willing to take the time to put yellow sticky traps out in soybean fields to continue to monitor for that variant population, because the way most people evaluate what their rootworm pressure is, how did my non-rootworm corn perform this year? And I've always said that how your non-rootworm corn performed this year tells you nothing about how many eggs could have been laid in your soybean fields this year. If you want to have an indication how many eggs are being laid in your soybean fields this year, you need some yellow sticky traps out in those fields. If you're not catching any beetles, which is basically what we've been finding when we go to the effort to do that, we're not catching any beetles. If we don't catch any beetles, very little egg laying going on, we don't need to be concerned. I think over time, the rootworm population will recover. It's on an upswing. I don't know if we'll ever get back to the glory days of rootworm like we were in 11, 12, 13, 14, when we had heavier pressure in first year corn than we did corn on corn in some cases, because the variant was kind of out of control. Other insects that we worry about is so dependent on winter and spring weather and environment, and do they blow in on storm fronts or do they overwinter, and how well do they overwinter? I think it's really hard to predict insect pressure from one year to the next, and our species that live here, overwinter here, lay eggs here, reproduce here, like corn rootworm does, those are a little easier to predict, I think, than the ones that migrate in.
2 comments I'll make. One on the corn on corn acre. I guess where I've seen issues the last couple of years is when we're not doing a good job of controlling the adults in corn. And so what I mean by that is that, in that fungicide application on corn, there's not an insecticide in with it to try to help knock down the adults. And in my area for 2 years in a row, that's the only place I've seen issues with corn on corn, is when we're not deploying that tactic. And so I continually encourage guys that if you're running corn on corn, we need to be looking at managing those adults and making sure that insecticide application is getting done. The second thing I always like to bring up in this conversation a lot of times is I believe there's a misconception that a good long hard winter with a lot of freezes will kill our rootworm population, and that has nothing to do with it.
Right.
If you think
have
about
you ever
it,
been to Minnesota or North Dakota? A lot of rootworm up there.
Yeah,
They're
exactly my
cold
point.
tolerant.
Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, parts of Nebraska, right? There's a lot of corn rootworm in that part of the country, and they're a heck of a lot colder than we are. The environment that has the biggest impact on corn rootworm populations is the soil moisture levels at hatch,
Right.
which is early June typically, right? So that is the biggest impact. They're not good swimmers. So if we drowned them during hatch, that is the biggest single impact that our soil, anything that goes on in the soil from a temperature or moisture perspective, will have any impact on it.
Right.
But I continually get that comment from people that if we just get a hard freeze, we,
Right.
we'll
Right.
kill them, or
Yeah.
we're going to have a lot of insects because we didn't have a hard freeze.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with it.
Yeah, they've actually done, some studies in laboratories. You can freeze rootworm solid, and when they thaw out, they'll crawl away. So they are pretty tolerant to cold soil conditions. And if you think about it, the soil never gets that cold. Once the soil freezes at 32 degrees, the soil temperature, if you look at a 4-inch depth soil probe in the soil through the winter, the soil doesn't ever get as cold as the air is getting. So whether we've got snow cover, don't have snow cover, cold winter, whatever, I agree with Chris, a wet early summer is what's hardest on rootworm, not particularly good for corn either. So
Right.
if we get enough water to drown rootworm, that's not going to be a good corn year either. 2015 comes to mind. That's when we kind of wiped out our local rootworm population, I think, was that 30 inches of rain that some people had in June in 2015. And that was also the time we went back to more rotation. We kind of got off our corn on corn kick that we were on, and we switched to Smart Stacks away from Triple Pro. So we went to a better rootworm product. We went back to rotation, and I think we've just enjoyed the benefits of maintaining that lower level population. But Northern Illinois and other places where farming practices are different, battling rootworm, as bad as we ever had, back in 11, 12, 13, 14. So they're still out there. They're not gone, and we still need to at least pay attention to them.
So I'm going to veer back to our crown rot conversation because we've actually had a few questions come in, and since we've got the subject matter
Good.
expert, I want
That's
to
right.
prioritize those. So Dirt Doctorful asked, you were mentioning no-till and tillage situations. So he's saying, is there any difference in tillage systems or no-till with crown rot?
So it's an element I haven't looked at. And I would, so any comment I would have would be kind of speculation and anecdotal. And I really don't even
As
have
agronomists, that's what you're paid to do.
That's right.
Speculate and anecdote.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't have a lot of anecdotal evidence either. But I think, again, as you go back to some of the comments we made around alleviating stress. So if those fields that are no-till or reduced till type situations, if they have more natural drainage to them, that can help alleviate some of the stress, right? So that might help minimize it. A lot of times in long-term no-till, you've got better infiltration rates when you do get that heavy rain, right? So that could be a benefit. So again, I'm throwing darts at the wall kind of with that. I don't really have any hard and fast information that would say one is greatly better than the other. Conversely, a freshly tilled soil can warm up a little faster, right? And may not be as cold, which can help, could give the wind to the darker soil. So I think there's some give and take there, and it's going to depend a little bit on the year and the environment.
With most of those, all of the crown rot pathogens, and just like SDS, those are all soil pathogens. They live in that soil environment, and the soil environment is different whether you're doing tillage or not. But I'm not sure it's different in a way that matters a lot to those pathogens. So we see plenty of crown rot in no-till. We see plenty of crown rot in conventional till. We see plenty of crown rot in strip till. I see a definite impact of soil type and soil and weather conditions, but I can't say that I haven't tested it either, but just all the fields that Chris and I walk, we're not seeing trends where tillage system makes much difference.
And just a quick clarifying question, John Green had asked about the research that you're mentioning with crown rot, and I believe we do have R3 application of fungicide in our crown rot trials. Is that correct, Lance? Do you mention that in prior episodes? And if you don't, will you?
So the work Chris has done, R3 has not been part of. Some of the work that we've done in our TD group, R3 has been part of. Chris has done a great job identifying heavy pressure sites. Some of our TD work, we're doing great trials, but we're doing them at our sites, which aren't necessarily heavy crown rot pressure. And so I'm not sure we've kind of looked at everything in the right spot. So yeah, we've got trials where we did V5 followed by R1. We've got trials where we did R1 followed by R3, R4. We've got, and I don't know that we did that I can think of. I'm not sure we had a trial out this year that was V5, R1, and R3, R4. And if we did, it was more of a tar spot trial or just a standard fungicide trial. It wasn't necessarily a crown rot trial. So that's probably a little bit of a miss there. And I know that, based on Chris's work with the amount of benefit a VT fungicide application has, I guarantee you when things are bad, and R3, R4 is going to help suppress crown rot as well, the same way the VT did. The reason we need the R3, R4 sometimes is because the VT is not going to last long enough to continue to protect you all the way to R6. And that's really what we're trying to do, is keep the plant healthy enough to R6 that, crown rot doesn't get out of hand. Because if that plant is dying from rust or dying from tar spot, it's under a tremendous amount of stress. And if there's crown rot present in that root system, the stress that it's under during grain fill, that's just going to snowball, and that plant's just going to take it out at the knees.
So we're in our final 4 minutes now. So I'm going to go ahead and start the drawing for our 6595.
Okay,
So we've had a
cool.
plethora of questions.
Yes.
I'm going to let Lance, Chris, you guys fight over who wants to.
Chris gets it. He's the guest. He's the
Gets
guest.
to pick.
Oh, I'm picking?
Yeah.
Oh, so I'm the one that's going to get blamed for this?
Yeah.
For a winner of 6595.
It's my show. I don't want to be blamed.
Yeah, you can run away. Lance got to come back.
I may or may not ever get invited back, if I do this. So
Who is our winner?
Lance Lovelace.
Wow.
Oh,
All right, Lance. And
yeah.
Lance actually submitted.
I will show you the name just so that everybody
Yeah,
knows
that's
I'm
right.
not a liar.
That's
Lance
right.
Lovelace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Great. Well,
Cool.
Lance, I appreciate it. And your questions. Lance has been great about submitting questions all season long. And he actually has our final question of today. So how fitting is that?
How perfect. Oh, the irony.
Yeah.
we two are both huge fans of irony. So
Yeah, that's right.
we love
That's
to
right.
point out irony as much as we possibly
Yeah.
can.
So Lance's final question is actually going back to the soybean conversation, and oddly enough, about tillage as well. So he's worried about in no-till situations. Do you see that there needs to be a percentage increase of your rate that you're planting in those early planted bean situations?
I generally don't recommend that. My opinion on seeding rates on soybeans is this: if you're putting an extra 10 or 20 or 30 or 40,000 out there for insurance purposes to guarantee you get a stand, I don't think that that's often very helpful, because if you get hit with a freeze, they're all dead. If you have wet saturated soils that suffocate the seedlings, they're all dead. If you have a terrible outbreak of Pythium, they're half dead. When bad things happen during soybean emergence, you typically don't lose 10 or 20% of your stand. You lose 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% of your stand. And unless you're double planting, you're probably still going to want to replant. So my recommendation is you plant the right rate the first time, and if you have to replant, so be it. I don't necessarily recommend overseeding as a way to guard against replanting. That's my personal opinion. I think there are situations where we will need to replant soybeans. I don't think they're very frequent. Soybeans are tougher than we give them credit for, and generally speaking, even if they struggle, even if it takes forever, I joke this summer, I'm a no-till guy. I mean, I didn't like my beans until about the 5th of August. I mean, it was a rough summer looking at no-till beans in some cases. They did great. Now, I don't know how much better they might have been if they were tilled, but I've been early planting no-till soybeans, for 2 or 3 years on our farm, not really increasing the seeding rate, assuming you're getting them planted well. Now, if 20% of them are laying on top of the ground because you got a crappy old planter like I do, then you might need some extra seed. But I'm not a big fan of overseeding in that scenario.
So the comments I will make is I agree with this. If you think one of us is long-winded, get us both together.
Yeah.
When we both want to chime in on the same question,
Should have been a 2-hour show.
So So I would agree with Lance that I do not encourage people to overplant just to try to help better yourself from the fear of a replant. But the one I do have a little bit of a perception and starting to think about basically what Lance's question is around is that I believe you can likely get by with fewer plants in a conventional tilled situation, right? To start with. And where I come at that from is that if you think about part of it is you're trying to determine number of nodes. And sometimes in a conventional till situation, right, you can get, we talked some about planting dates a while ago, right? So in that conventional till, darker soil, we get a little earlier growth. Sometimes those plants get a little bit taller. Sometimes we get a few extra nodes on those plants. And nodes is where you ultimately got to have where flowers are going to develop and where you're going to end up having pods. And in a no-till situation or reduced till situation, if your planting is delayed or your emergence is slower, you may or may not end up with the same node count. And so if you have a higher population where you can help drive node count on a per acre basis, that can help yield. So from my perspective, that's where it comes from in the conversation, not about trying to plant more just to protect yourself from the potential loss of a replant situation.
Right. And I like the way you've positioned that, and I would support that as well. I don't necessarily think if there is a big benefit to tillage with early planted soybeans, I don't know that you're going to level the yield playing field between no-till and till ground by increasing your seeding rate on the no-till.
Correct.
Maybe there's an extra bushel or two to gain there, but that may not narrow that may not close the gap if that gap does in fact exist.
Yep.
And I don't know if we're going to, trend towards more tillage on soybeans. I don't want to go away from my no-till. I don't want to go away from my cover crops. I went past a field a few days ago, actually called the local dealer to find out whose field it was because it was a strip field of corn stalks. And I was looking for some corn on corn locations for Smart Stacks Pro. And I thought, hey, that'd be perfect. I'll find out who that farmer is. Well, those strips are made for soybeans.
Beans.
Yep. So I'm not a big 30-inch row bean guy either, but strip till 30-inch row soybeans or something that would make a big difference.
I have several guys in my territory. I don't know about several. I have a few guys within my footprint that are trying it this year.
Yeah. And that's, I love strips. I have not worked with beans and strips, but no better way to raise corn. So I'm sure soybeans would appreciate it as well.
Alrighty, that's all we've got time for.
So we are at time. So Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Always nice to have a guest and break up the monotony of listening to me talk for an hour. My wife can tell you how horrific that is. So appreciate everybody joining us today. Lance, congratulations for winning the 6 bags of DEKALB corn. And I really appreciate everybody who has participated and asked questions through the year. That, as Chris alluded to earlier, when I started this, that was my passion. When I do live meetings, that's the part of the meeting I love. If my manager's watching, I always tell him if I can find a job that all I have to do is just answer questions of farmers all day long, every day, that's what I'm shooting for. So that's what I love, and so we've always been trying to drive more live engagement. So if you enjoy being on here, please ask your questions, and we think your questions make the program better. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great holiday season, and we'll be back with you, I think, January 6th.
Yep.
So
thank you.